Good morning. How are you?
It's a pretty big breakout group, but that's okay.
Yes.
We just found that these breakout groups are a better way for people to have conversations. And I think we have panel members on, and then we also have folks on who can answer questions, I think, which is super helpful. Taylor, you're going to share the screen with the recommendations. And is Kathy Lenahan on?
No, you get me, Jill,
Oh, Jill. Hi, Jill.
Elena, and Kathy, and you and I.
Got it. Great. So Jill and I are going to lead this breakout session, and Taylor is our lovely assistant who will go back and forth with slides as we need them. And we have more than what you saw. So if questions come up, we'll try to access data or information that was used. We just wanted to start by open-ended for panel members. What are your reactions to the recommendations? And Taylor's going to put them up. And then Jill, I'll have you do the second question after we finish this part.
Sounds good.
Well, if I could just say it's Fran. I read the recommendations beforehand and all the background, and I think they make a whole lot of sense. These are the exact things that we struggled with in, for instance, a Bridgeport. So I think they make excellent sense. I didn't know what it meant when you say actual cost rather than market value.
Yeah.
And I didn't unmute him fast enough to ask in the main group. So could you tell me what that is?
Yes, it's actually a really good question. And that is a perfect example of where we get into OEC speak, because we're dealing with it every day. But the rest of the world doesn't know that a lot of the market, how the market works. So for the Child Care Development Fund funding, the Care for Kids funding as part of the rules around the Child Care Development Block Grant, the state has to do a market rate survey. And so that is required of us. The challenge with that, as we've been talking about, is that the market in early childhood, the market rate does not reflect the full cost of care. The programs can't make it without fundraising or other sources of funding. And so what some states have been moving to is we're going to use the full cost of care as our guide. So the feds say your rates in Connecticut are too low because you are only at 35% of the market rate. So we have to report the market rate to the feds and where our Care for Kids rates are. Now, with the governor's changes over the past over the next few years, we will move up to between 50 and 80% of the market rate. Still not at the market rate, not at the cost of care. So that's I hope that explains that. And if anyone wants to weigh in to clarify, please do.
Thank you, Commissioner. That's really helpful.
Fran, I also want to add that currently the market rate and even the true cost of care right now, the true cost of care right now does not include a livable wage for early childhood educators. So we have a little bit of work to do to get to the true market rate.
Got it. That makes
the true cost of care.
Yes.
Sorry, true cost of care.
Yeah.
You're right.
I have one more quick question, I think. Oh, goodness. Oh, your readiness money now covers infants and toddlers as well?
Another really good question. So school readiness was a program specifically for 2 years. There are two things changing: 2 years for 3 and 4-year-olds.
Yep.
And we, in general, did not pay for a third year. Now, with the change in the kindergarten age, that's likely to change, where it'll be more like 2.5 years or 3 years for some kids for preschool. But a bill passed last year that allows communities who need infant toddler care more, and those community-based decisions would happen to convert preschool spaces into infant toddler spaces, much like child daycare. That's an example of where there's more alignment, because child daycare centers can do that. If they can't recruit preschoolers, they can turn spaces into infant toddler spaces. So yes, that's a brand new thing. So school readiness dollars now can be used for infant toddlers, but it's a community-based decision-making process.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Beth, if
Yeah.
I may, I
Yeah.
would love to say just a few words about market rate and cost
Yeah,
of care,
please.
and
Sure.
then talk a little bit about these recommendations overall, which I'm very excited about. Just because we've been talking in very technical language, and I know not everyone here has the lived experience of educators and families, a market rate is trash. And the reason a market rate is trash is that educators in communities where parents don't have a lot of money will charge whatever the subsidy covers. So if you're basing your subsidy by asking them what they're charging, it's a cat chasing its tail. Cost of care is a shift towards saying, what is this actually costing you? And I think this is one of the most important decisions we can make, is to actually pay educators what we know it takes to get to a living wage, which is why I really want to underline and put an exclamation point when we know that educators are, going on energy assistance or foregoing rent because the market rate is so low. So I just wanted everyone to really understand why that's so important. The other thing, I'm very excited about these recommendations, but a lens that I would love for us to bring is the way in which family childcare educators and family friend and neighbor educators are often not included in the systems, in the governing bodies, in all these kinds of programs and resources. And I think the great advantage of consolidation is it might provide a road for inclusion, but the great danger is that it just further excludes the community-based providers on whom families rely so deeply. So, the how of that, I think, is nuanced and complex. And we have a history of local governing bodies here in Connecticut that has not always been pretty. So just to be very thoughtful about that as we go through the recommendations.
Thank you, Jessica. I think those are really important sort of core principles, and it may be that we really need to put something about family child care providers as part of the system as a core operating principle. Other comments on just general reaction? Yeah, Karen.
So good morning, everyone. I have two thoughts. One, when I first moved into early childhood education from the public school sector, it was daunting to me, all of the systems in early childhood education, from the licensing to how you get paid to the funding structure. So I really like the fact of looking at the system and how the system can be more integrated. And I think it's a really good point. It's not about alignment, right? But real structural change, I think, is really important. And I think it could help early childhood education directors focus more on the quality factors around teaching and learning, to not have so many different streams to have to keep track of. So I think the direction is a really good one. I do have a question. If this moves forward, are we talking about recommendations, or are we talking about mandates that programs will participate in, if there's one unified system? Because, I know OEC walks that line between sometimes it's recommendations and then sometimes they're mandates. So where would this fall? Because I think that's going to be a critical point about how it would play out across the state, and would it really be structural change, whether it's a recommendation or a mandate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's part of what the panel will recommend. For example, programs entering staff in the registry to have data about what's out there. You know, in schools, everyone's in the certification system where the town has. In ours, it's basically state-funded programs are required, but other programs are not. So that's just one example of a system that exists that is complicated because not everybody's in it. So I think some of that will be up to the panel to recommend.
And Karen, one of the things that we've been talking about in the work group is that how do we approach it from a strengths-based approach, and instead of mandate it, incentivize it. And it could be incentivized to access to services, to products, or even financial incentives. So we're looking at ways that we can build a strength-based system where it's not so much thus shall or thus must, but the recommendation with the strength of the incentives to include non-state funded programs to want to participate in the system.
Yeah. And I know mandates aren't popular. People don't like the mandates, but if you're really talking about structural change in the truest form, it seems to me like would have to come with, this is what must be done. Because I think there's so many things that are optional, which makes it so hard to really kind of wrap your arms around the real current structure in ECE.
And I think the other part that we've been talking about is how do we send the message that this isn't a mandate to be a burden to you. This is a mandate to streamline, your business practices. If a parent goes in when the child's a newborn and completes a registration packet, it types all the information on in line, and you only have to update it annually and add any changes. I mean, Karen, how many parents have you tried to email or call that you couldn't get a hold of because you couldn't read their handwriting, right? If a parent goes online, types everything in, and the provider just downloads it. So I think part of the goal will be to package it in a way that lets providers know that this is a business aid that's going to promote your business, that's going to be almost like an assistant, that handles all the registration and things for you. So I think the way we package it to providers is going to be important too, so that they can see where it will aid them as business people. Because let's face it, sometimes early childhood educators, one of the struggles we have is seeing ourselves as business people because we like working with the children and the families. We need to pay a little bit more attention to business. And if we can create a system that does that for you, then maybe we can promote the use of it without making it feel, I got to do this, but I want to do this because it's going to make me a better business person.
Fran.
Just two quick things. Number one, I heard you speak about regional governance structures and how regionalization seems to be a negative word in our state. Regionalization is a negative word, unfortunately, because I think we could benefit from some regionalization right now, but I don't think we're there yet. But regionalism and regional governance, I think, makes a whole lot of sense. And I think you have a lot of people that would definitely get behind that.
Yeah, I think just for clarification, because I'm glad you raised that, Fran, I think this work group is going to suggest a regional structure that supports local governance, because where we only have 56 community collaboratives or school readiness councils, and we have 169 towns, and we want that local decision-making, we don't think it's realistic to think that there'll be 169 early childhood councils. In some cases, towns will get together. In other places, a local one might be missing. So the regional entity will have the responsibility of doing the local needs assessment. So it's a structure that we're recommending to the panel for governance and to assure, what Lynn Kagan talks about as the stakeholders have a say. So, and you said you had 2 points. So that's just an answer to sort of, we're not ruling it out. I would just say in the work sessions, people kept telling us, be careful of that word, be careful in the public input session. So I think the panel's going to have to think about how we frame that, but if they decide to take that recommendation. But we do think it's an important structure for early childhood.
I do think it's important. And I think, maybe we just play with the word or whatever, but
Yeah.
yeah. The other piece that I would say is I've done overseen school systems, but and early childhood has been a part of it, but I don't pretend to know all the specifics. And I would say to you that I had some trouble in reading all of this because you go to abbreviations that you all know.
Right.
And
point.
those abbreviations might have been explained pages ago, but
Exactly.
I had to go back and look for them. So I would just ask that they be spelled out or whatever.
We will do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for that reminder. As I said in my presentation, it's so easy to go there, and it's
Yeah,
really hard because we want people who don't live in our world to look at this and say, wait a minute, why are you guys doing this? Because we don't see it anymore.
and we do the same thing in K-12, so I get it.
Yep. Yep.
Right.
Good reminder.
Do we have any more questions before we move on to our next discussion question? Okay, so what do you need more clarity on? What would you like more information about so that you could understand the recommendations, understand the current situation and where we want to go and some of the things that are going to be required? Is there any clarity that you would need as panel members to understand the recommendations and the current situation a little bit more?
Good morning, everyone. I can't remember on which one of these platforms that I had requested what needs to be legislatively moved and what needs to be mandated, maybe, or OEC could standardize it through rules or regulations or however that worked, broken up into categories possibly, so we could understand how quickly some of these recommendations may be able to move and what we can prioritize that doesn't take the long haul.
That's a really good point. So maybe if we put the recommendations in a table with like a mark of, is this federal, is this state, is this a general practice, is this like who has the power? I think that's a really great suggestion.
Thank you. That would be helpful.
Yeah, our team taking notes on that, just so we remember to do that for the panel. Okay, great.
Does anybody else have any? Oh, Karen, go ahead. Sorry.
So I just have a question. It seems like we've got two sectors in early childhood education. We've got community-based programs. We've got private for-profit programs. How are all of those two worlds going to come together, right? Are these recommendations really going to be across the board? Is there the ability to put these recommendations in place or mandates that would cover not just state funded programs, but also privately funded programs? I think I spoke to before that there just seems to be two sectors, right? Even when we look at compensation, do we really know what private sector is paying their staff compared to community-based programs? So that's just my question about how does this play out ultimately across the entire ECE community, or does it?
Yeah, well, I think that's a question of how wide the recommendations go. But I think there's also a third, Karen, which is the public schools. You know, they serve as many children as both the state funded programs put together, and then Head Start serves a whole lot of kids. So with their own set of rules. So we, for example, the state can't control what Head Start does. That is a federal to local. And we met with the federal Head Start office this week to try to better understand which of their systems we can leverage. So we're not layering on top of Head Start programs, state systems, if there are things we can just take from them. But this is the complexity is there are private businesses. There are private businesses that have no connection to the state. They don't take subsidy. They don't they don't have school readiness slots or CDC slots. They are regulated by the Office of Early Childhood. So we do an inspection there. But as we try to understand the whole system, you know, that is a question. How far do these recommendations go? And I'm really, this is a good conversation topic for folks to weigh in now, even because that is a core question. Like the registry, do we have everyone? I mean, we did that with the wage supports. If you want the wage supports, you got to put your people in the registry. To Jill's point, we used the carrot there to try to get much more information about the workforce, because we were missing 2/3 of the workforce in our data system. And to your point, we try to figure out what is a fair wage as we're looking at compensation. If we don't know what the private programs are paying, and we're trying to figure out what the full cost of care is, there's real gaps because of the mixed model that we have, and there are real strengths in the mixed model too. So I don't know if people want to weigh in with their thoughts on that, but I think Karen's question is a super important one related to the scope of the panel's work and the system building.
One thing I want to add, well, we'll wait for somebody to raise their hand, is that that is always in the back of our head, Karen, because even if you look at the funding systems recommendations we're making, that only impacts 30% of the providers because they're state funded providers, right? So we thought long and hard. And one of the things, and again, it's a small gap filler, but one of the things that we're working on is creating systems that would build those that are privately funded, build their business capacity. We did a study with SVP last fall, and we found that there are millions of dollars being lost in the state for all providers when a space goes vacant 1 or 2 weeks out of the month. And that's for full pay provider, private providers too. So helping them work on their business practices, because while we can't give them funding because they're not state funded, we can incentivize some services to get them business supports to help structure their business in a way that they can efficiently run, so that they're not losing that money due to vacant spaces. I mean, I'm sure that I've been to your center. You have, front office workers who are probably calling parents and enrolling them. Some private owned centers or smaller centers don't have that. So how often do spaces go vacant? Because nobody's calling them back because the director's in the classroom, right? Nobody's calling parents back. So the navigation system would help fill that gap. But also, what are the other business practices? And again, this is just a small finger hole in the dike, but what business practices can we strengthen in private centers so that they can help sustain and stabilize their businesses, independent of state funding, because they don't receive state funding. But the difference between what we can do with state funded and private funded is always part of our conversation. I want to say at least daily, like, how do we support those that aren't state funded, and how do we make this work? Because in order for us to change the landscape, we need all the data, but how do we get all the data if everybody doesn't have to use the system?
Yeah, that it's a core question. Lorna.
If I may just say as well, and I appreciate the question as well, or rather the comment, Karen, and I think what you're touching on echoes what we've strived to share with all of the work groups, in that equity and access is always a part of the conversation. And so what you're speaking about emphasizes that all the more. So thank you again for raising that point.
Any panel members want to weigh in on how far does this go when we talk about the childcare system and recommendations from the panel about the system of childcare in the state? Anyone else want to weigh in?
I would.
Yeah, Fran. Yep.
I guess it's aspirational, but if in the best of all worlds, it would be everybody. Included, to give us a really good view of what is happening to our youngest children, and how are we caring for them, and just a full picture. And I get it, I didn't realize that Head Start had as much of like they have over $200 million, right, in Connecticut. So they have a lot of programs, and I think it would be important. I do think it's important to include the public schools and the community-based programs. I would push for that. I guess I would be very happy if just the state-funded programs move forward and we had some data from that. But in the best of all worlds, I would love to see everyone included.
Yeah,
So
great.
I hear Karen and Fran sharing that it should be everybody. So does anybody on the call, panelist, have any ideas how that could be implemented? How we could approach that so it could be everybody without making it, like Karen said, that crunchy mandated, like makes people go like this. Like, is there a way that what solutions do you have or what ideas do you have to move us towards that? Does anybody have any suggestions?
The suggestion, there was one, I think Beth said that there's one entry point, which is licensing.
Right.
That is a good place to start asking questions. When folks apply for their license or they're maintaining
That's
their
a
license,
great question.
start capturing data from the point where you have people, where you meet people at the fork in the road. So
Right.
after that, you don't have them anymore because they're doing their own thing. But upon licensing,
Yeah.
you
right.
could understand the workforce, you could understand salaries, you could understand. And when they ask, why do you want to know this? We're building a system here. We're building a system here, right? So instead of creating multiple checkpoints or
Yeah.
trying to recreate the wheel, you have to meet people at where they are, and you also have to meet people where they're used to meeting you. So they can recognize, okay, this is part of a process, this is part of a systematic way of thinking. And when I get my license, or when I get whatever that looks like, or maybe there are other checkpoints or other touch points that OEC has with these. And I think somebody just put in the chat that you have license exempt providers. There has to be a checkpoint somewhere.
Yeah.
It might not be the same checkpoint. There may be a checkpoint somewhere where you could begin to ask some of these questions so your data is stronger, so you could begin to understand things better.
I think we should make a strong note of that. And I see Liz is on the phone from licensing, but we now have an e-license system where we've moved everything to iPad. So it's one of the systems that we have, what do you call it? We've automated more. So,
But does that include the public schools? Would that include public schools?
no, but the public schools, like, I had to get some information about Norwich this week, and I called the public schools for data, and I had it in a day, everything I needed. They have really good counts of kids, and they have information about salaries. Like, that is a model in many ways, and it's a system we're not linked to and need to link to, right, Fran? We're going to work on that as part of the systems work, is the data needs to be connected. But yeah, so even though there's some unlicensed, I think the only piece that really falls outside that's hard to get data from then would be the town run, like, recreation programs. But we could probably, with what Monette just suggested, capture 95% of the system.
Just make it part of our process.
Yeah, it's a great suggestion. We hadn't been thinking about licensing that way. And the other piece is the Elevate system. As we implement that more, and programs receive beginner level 1, level 2, level 3 there. And I think, Deb, it's member plus, and member accredited, right? But where every program will have a shape to say, you are at this level. That is another place that they interact, which we really need to think harder about. You've just brought those things together for us. So we should make note of that.
I also think, if I could just say, to pick up on what Jill said about incentivizing, I've been in leadership a long time, and what I'm realizing, and what I have realized, is it's really not about compliance. It's, if you want something to change systemically on a deep level, it's about persuasion. So, it's persuading everyone that data system is something they want to be included with. They want to have their outcomes in there, that they want to be included in the entry system, the portal where they're advertised and can bring students in that way. So
Yeah.
Really think incentivizing and letting them know just what they're going to get to be part of this is a really good way to go.
Great. Liz, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, and I think that's an amazing idea that just seems like so simple. But I also want to stress that I think family child care providers, unlike centers, really need to be coached. And I think we are working on that. I think so many of them start out with, I like children, I'm home with my own kids, I'd like to add, another child or two. I'm not looking at it like this is a business per se, but I have to be licensed. That's annoying. We need to like change the mindset, I think, of these providers.
Yeah. Well, Liz and Jill, you both came to us at OEC from family child care. So you remember being like, just, oh, I'll have a couple of kids come in, and then you just kept moving up professionally. And we really see a lot of that professionalization in the family child care world. Shailene.
Yeah, I think the incentivizing piece is great, but I think going to the point of supportiveness, I think speaking to how we're going to support folks onboarding is really important. And to the staff family childcare piece, I think that the network we have now is really business savvy. And in Hartford, we're trying to get them on board to be part of this early learning community. But the supportive piece of using the tool has to be considered. It has to be user friendly, especially with the capacity that folks have right now. And when we talk about equity here in Hartford, what we're trying to do with our staff, family, child care, and center base to try to create a more unified system to capture that is aligning it with the public schools. We're having that conversation actually today, but really try to get the providers on board when it comes to staff, family, child care, of what it means and how does it help their business become more quality. But not only do we have to change the mindset of the providers, we have to change the mindset of the community that looks at the providers. Because I would say that the staff, family, child care providers compared to center base, when it comes to business, we're seeing them treat it more like a business than center base, who's had all this support and all this funding. So it's really the landscape that we look at them, not so much how they look at us. So I just wanted to bring up that caveat.
Thanks, Shailene. And Monette.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is the correct space to lift this up again, but I had mentioned like marketing. We all keep talking about changing the narrative. We all keep talking about spinning the words on their heads to make sense about this new evolution or revolution of early childhood systems. And I don't know if this is the good place or time to start injecting these recommendations to build a marketing campaign around, parents, around business, around center base, or whatever this looks like, because again, multi-layered, and it's all different target areas, but the message has to be unified and it has to be cohesive and coherent, right? So I'm not sure when that point is where we start injecting recommendations to say, okay, what's the marketing campaign around this? What is the information sharing and the desegregate, whatever that is, whatever those hot, sexy words are now, to say, this is the way we're going to say it. This is the way we're all going to say it in Spanish, French, Creole, everything all the time. And then it starts to resonate. And then our target audience starts to say it back to us. Because if we don't start doing that soon and often, something gets lost.
Totally. This is the right space. The marketing campaign is part of the systems work, and trying to, because it's not just having an enrollment system, it's making sure that parents understand why this is important, why they want to enroll in a program. And I know, Karen, you guys are going like door to door. You have a whole marketing campaign just to remind parents why this is important. So it supports our centers and our family childcare homes if we are reminding parents why this is so important. So yes, this is, I think, so let's put an exclamation point toward any marketing recommendations. Jessica.
Yeah, thank you. So 2 notes, and these are in some ways less about systems, but they very much influence what we're looking for. So this goes to the ways in which different sets of recommendations are connected. But actually a third thing, which is just, I'm really excited about the marketing, being super intentional about including family childcare, I think is always very important. But the 2 notes, in terms of data sharing with the state, I think lack of trust based on the history of, sometimes reasons for that lack of trust is one of the biggest barriers that we face. And so thinking about what the state's interactions with educators are like is going to be critical. And that actually is part of systems, right? It's part of how you implement those systems. Yeah, actually, both of these are part of systems. So that's number one. Really think about what those interactions are like and what educators' experience of the state is. We, for example, were prepared to pilot a shared services tech solution in partnership with the state a few years ago before the pandemic. But when educators learned that the state was going to see their financial data, they no longer wanted to participate. So, thinking about how that's set up.
Right. And
The
I think
other
that
piece-
for centers, I think it's for proprietary businesses, that's a normal response. So we have to think about what we're asking to share to be part of the system. So it's not, I think it's family childcare, but it's also many
Yes. Yeah. I think that's a great point. The other thing is, if we're really looking at how to fill programs much faster, we need to look at presumptive eligibility for Care for Kids, because that is one of the single biggest barriers for educators, is that when they take parents who are entering the system, they don't know if they're going to qualify for Care for Kids or not. And so families and educators get stuck in this kind of waiting pattern, where if we had presumptive eligibility for the first 30 days and a really rigorous timeline for determination, we could get all this moving much, much faster.
Jessica, do you have examples of states that might be doing presumptive eligibility?
Yeah, I can pull some examples
that would be
for
great,
you.
because
We
that would
looked
help
at this a few years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think it would really help. We hear nightmare stories about centers that enroll kids, they have them for a month, they're providing all the care, the state says no, the parent pulls their kid, the provider's out a month's care. So if there's I think that would go a long way for our financing group to understand if there are ways to stop that problem, because it's one for both, again, all kinds of providers to take care for kids. And then it reduces the number of providers who will take care for kids. It gets in the way of parents getting to work because the providers won't take the kids. And then you have a group of providers that do take the kid and they get hit with the most losses because of that. So I think that's a great suggestion.
Fantastic. I'm so excited that you're interested in this. I mean, it would be a real game changer. So
yeah, we just have to make sure it falls within the federal rules. and I think the panel should definitely consider it.
Well, those great solutions.
Yes. I think we go back in about 2 minutes, Jill, is that right?
I just got a text message. We go back at 10:23, so we have 2 minutes.
All right. So as we close out, any last thoughts? And know that, panel members, you have feedback forms. You can send us information. We sent you a way too long brief, which you probably didn't get to read the whole thing yet, but it is something that gives you many more details here, and you can send in your responses, but this has generated some great improvements. Yeah, go.
One more question. I know that it's about and I think it's a great idea, the portal that's going to list all of the early childcare services. Will there be other ways as well? What I'm thinking about is the local governance or the local schools or whatever, where families can go that might not be as comfortable going on a portal.
That's a great point. So I think that what Fran is suggesting is, let's look at what are the local ways where families can enter, because we do know the way families enter public schools sort of works. And I know in our community, you go there and they do give you preschool options if you can't afford private preschool. That's just part of the public school enrollment system, because more and more public schools are offering preschool, so more parents are going there. but often they don't have capacity, but for 20% of the system. So then 80% of the parents are like, well, what do I do? And so that's a great point. So some local connection, local based enrollment.
Yeah, family resource centers and
Exactly.
Yeah,
government.
family resource centers are a great idea,
That
actually.
came up in the public listening session, and the general idea we talked about was that it would depend on the community because every community is different. So we would ask the community to build on their strengths in that community. But yeah, definitely, because not everybody's going to be comfortable with data systems or have access to data systems.